Hey, we're in Fuel Week 2, right? So if you haven't been here, you haven't joined us yet, we are studying the life of Moses in 4 short weeks. I have bit off more than I can chew on this one, okay? So if you're with me, you've bitten off more than you can chew, too. Today, we've got a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to have to move fairly rapidly. We may have to call an audible on some things in the service here towards the end, but bear with me. Okay, so if you were here last week, you know that our character, Moses, was spent 40 years in what we called the Desert School of Character Development. Do you guys remember this school we talked about? Remember the classes? Obscurity 101, Time Management 301, Solitude 401. I know these are everybody's favorite classes. And at the end, at the end of 40 years in the desert, God meets Moses in a miraculous way, burning in a bush that doesn't burn up. The fuel that will fuel Moses' life, that will fuel the Israelites' people's life, is seen in this bush. And we talked about how for years I had seen that story as something that was super intimidating. But I think God showed me a side of it that says that's really actually an intimate moment. Come closer, Moses. Take off your shoes. Dwell in my warmth. Listen to my words coming out of this miracle for you. Has anybody ever had that intimidating versus intimate issue with somebody? I had a coach in high school, a basketball coach, Dan the Man Armstrong. Okay, you don't get to be called Dan the Man Armstrong if you're not big, if you're not strong, if you're not intimidating, do you? Did you have a Dan the Man Armstrong in your life? I love this guy. I was afraid of this guy, but I love this guy. And for whatever reason, he kind of took me under his wing. I remember his big, giant mitts just kind of coming around my shoulder, saying, Chris, you can jump higher. You can run faster. You can make more free throws in a row than you ever thought imaginable. He was intimate with me, and something about this combination of intimidatingness and intimate just made me want to do whatever this guy thought I could do. He brought me to a newer level, and we see that happen with Moses. Moses gets this assignment, this impossible assignment from this intimate moment with God, and he's got to go back to Egypt. He's got to battle Pharaoh, the most powerful person on the planet. Okay, we're going to explore a little bit of what it's like to be Moses in this situation and a little bit of what it's like to be Pharaoh in this situation. We pick up the story of God speaking out of the bush, Exodus 3, verse 9. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God later on says, I will be with you. And Moses says, I don't even know who to tell the people is sending me. Who are you, God? And in verse 14, God says to Moses, I am who? I am who I am. This is what you are saying to the Israelites, that I am has sent me to you. Moses is saying, who am I? And God is saying, I am who? That's where you'll get the power. That's where you get the ability to do what I'm asking you to do. First myth that we're going to explore today, and I've already really explored it, unpacked it for you. The myth is this, that you can do what God asks you to do without him. Those are your blanks. You can do what God asks you to do without him. Jesus himself, God's own son, sinless, powerful to heal, in John 5, verse 19 says this, I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. And in case his listeners didn't get the point, 11 verses later, in verse 30, he says, by myself I can do nothing. It's not on the screen for you, but you know. You've heard this before. Jesus himself, by myself, he says, I can do nothing. Wow. You, me, none of us can do what God is asking us to do in any kind of measurable way without him. So what happens? Moses goes back to Egypt, confronts Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians. Basically, he says, Pharaoh, here's the deal. God, this I am, this burning bush God, has told me to take my people, the Israelites, out in the wilderness. We're going to have a little Burning Man festival, but it's not Burning Man, it's to God. We're going to have a little festival in the desert. Please let us go. It's just going to be a 3-day worship fest. Let us go. What does Pharaoh say? Okay, you saw Prince of Egypt, right? What did he say? He said no. In fact, he said, no way. He said, listen to me. So you people, you slaves that are making the bricks for us, you have so much time on your hands that you think that you can just go out in the desert and have a little worship fest, sing some songs? Come on. If you have that much time, here's what we're going to do. We're taking away the straw. See, they made bricks with straw in them. We're no longer supplying the straw, an important raw ingredient for the bricks. Go get your own straw, Israelites. And by the way, still make the same number of bricks. Your quota is still the same. It hasn't changed at all. So how's it going for Moses so far? Right? Pharaoh is definitely not happy with him. He's made work hard for everybody. In fact, the Israelite foremen of the brick-making teams start to get really angry too because they've got a lot of work, a lot more work. They start complaining to Moses. Exodus 5, verse 21, this is the foreman. And they say, may the Lord look upon you, Moses, and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and you have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Moses was just doing what God asked him to do. Now everybody hates him. Moses is on everybody's last nerve, isn't he? Who is happy with Moses at this point in time? Maybe his family, maybe his dog. Moses faces opposition from without. Moses faces opposition from within. And he has to stand alone against the most powerful person in the world. 2 weeks ago in the Bold series, Bold Leadership, bold leaders must sometimes stand alone, right? Moses was prepared. We talked about this last week. How could he stand alone if he had never been alone with God? How would he have the inner fortitude? How would he be able to hear God's voice to be able to stand up in this pressure-filled situation? Myth number 2. Opposition, which Moses was facing from within and from without, means that you are in the wrong position. Opposition means that you are in the wrong position. People don't like you, you should just go somewhere else, right? Things aren't working out, do something different. Here's a couple of quotes for you that I found. G. Campbell Morgan says, if you have no opposition in the place you serve, you're serving in the wrong place. How about T.D. Jakes? You face your greatest opposition when you're closest to your biggest miracle. Anybody believe that? It's always darkest before the dawn. See, I've heard people say that you know God is in whatever you're doing when the doors fly wide open, right? When the path is easy. When everything is clear, all of your steps are just made easy for you. You know the problem with that, don't you? This book. You find anybody in this book who God told them to do something? Oh, easy. Easy button. Let's push the easy button. That was simple. That was easy. It's a myth that that opposition means that you are in the wrong position. These are things that these are myths that Moses needed to break for himself so that he could do what God was calling him to do. So what happens next? Things are not going well for Moses. Oppressed from within, oppressed from without. He goes back to Pharaoh. He says, let my people go, right? And Pharaoh says, no. And he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no. And then it starts to say, Pharaoh's heart was hardened towards the people, was hardened in this whole situation. He wasn't going to give in. He wasn't going to admit that he was wrong. What was happening, you have to understand the culture of the time in Egypt. In Egypt, Pharaoh was the god. But he wasn't alone in that. He had lots of other gods too. In fact, they had gods, about anything you looked at in the Egyptian culture at that time would be some kind of a god. And so what God is going to do here through Moses is he's going to start to break the next myth that we're going to look at. He's going to break the myth that the Lord, that's capital L-O-R-D, Yahweh is the translation, the God of this book, is one of just many gods. Why listen to him, Moses? I've got all these other gods over here, of which one I am. I don't need that. There are many gods. Why is your God more important? That's the myth, that the Lord is one of many gods. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we struggle with this as well, don't we? I mean, you may not be worshiping the river. You may not be worshiping beetles or frogs or any other weird thing like that. But what do we worship? We worship ourselves a little bit, don't we? We're kind of like Pharaoh. I'm God. I'm master of my own domain. I am my own king. And some of the lesser gods are my car, my career, my abilities, my bank account, the things that I'm good at. Right? Aren't they kind of our gods too? God is going to crush all these gods with what ends up being 10 plagues. God's response to this idea that there are many gods is this. Exodus 7, verse 16. God says Moses to say this. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, distinction there, has sent me to say to you, let my people go so that they may worship me in the desert. But until now you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. There was one more slide there. Here's the deal. First plague, the Nile River turns to blood. It turns blood. Was it actual blood or not? We don't know. It was undrinkable. It was red. It was disgusting. The fish were dying. And here's assault number one. Here's Mythbuster number one that God is doing. You see, the Nile was a god to the Egyptians. They lived in a desert land. Here was this big river. They lived in kind of a nice, lush, marshy area. And they attributed that favor to the god of the river Nile. And God was saying, oh, that's your God? Watch me dominate. Watch me crush that God. All the water, it says, is affected. The river, the ponds, the buckets, everything was affected. If we were in Steamboat and that was happening, all the buckets, all of the hot tubs would be filled with blood. All of your Nalgene's would be filled with blood. Your Camelbacks filled with blood. First plague. Was that enough for Pharaoh? No. Second plague had to come. Frogs, the plague of the frogs. Ooh, frogs are gross, aren't they? Frogs are everywhere. Frogs are jumping all over the place. Everywhere you look, frogs. In Pharaoh's penthouse, frogs. Up your pant leg, frogs. Everywhere you looked, frogs. That's disgusting, isn't it? I don't like frogs. The place was stinking with dead fish. Now the frogs die. They're stinking and rotting in the sun. This place is getting a little bit smelly. There was a goddess named Heka, which was the frog goddess of childbirth. Ooh, another mythbuster on the Egyptian gods. Plague 2. Plague number 3. We have to move a little fast here. Gnats. Gnats are everywhere, swarming all over the place. Experts aren't sure if they were mosquitoes or lice or really just gnats like we know them. They were all over the place. Up until this point, Pharaoh had magicians using satanic power to duplicate these plagues. This one, they couldn't. In fact, the magician said, this must be the finger of God. We can't do this. And God said, I'm enough playing around with your gods. Here I go. Gnats everywhere. Fourth plague, flies, swarms of flies everywhere. We think we have it bad here. I don't know if you guys know the fly situation around Use Old Bible Church. I don't know if it's bad at your house. I don't know. Flies buzzing bzz, 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 everywhere. There wasn't a soup bowl that didn't have a fly or more dropped dead in it. Something interesting happens, though. The flies are everywhere except for the land called Goshen. Goshen was the land just where the Israelite people lived. So God was now making a distinction. My people are safe from these plagues. Plague number 5, livestock. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the cattle, the sheep, the goats, the cows. And cows were a god, to the Egyptians. They start falling down dead. The place is littered with bodies of fish, frogs, and all kinds of livestock stinking and rotting. Can you imagine this? It's hot there. This is getting stinky. This is getting gross. People are getting fed up. It's thought that these flies were starting to spread the anthrax or some kind of anthrax-like virus around to all the people. Plague number 6, boils. Moses picks up a handful of soot, throws it in the air. That was symbolic of a black magic ritual at the time. As the soot disperses, the people are plagued with boils. Anybody ever had a boil? Ooh, I haven't. My younger brother had a boil once. My mom lanced it. I was 3 rooms away. I was crying because my brother was screaming in pain. Still, to that day, it's just, lancing. People were filled with boils. Now they live in a stinky, gross land full of dead stuff all over the place, and now they're painfully breaking out in boils. Is this enough for Pharaoh to let his people go? No, his heart continues to be hardened, doesn't it? And it's coming if you know the order of the plagues. And then all hail broke loose, right? Hail is the next plague. Little bullets of ice falling from the sky, rapidly stripping the plants of all their vegetation, of all their fruit, of all their vegetables, killing animals and people. It's happening everywhere except where God's people are. God takes a little break here in plague number 7 to remind Pharaoh what is going on here. This guy just can't get it through his thick skull, through his thick heart, that he needs to let God's people go, that God, our God, Yahweh, is the God above any other of these pretend gods. Exodus 9, verse 15, God saying to Pharaoh, "For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I've raised you up, Pharaoh, for this very purpose, that I might show my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." It's going to take a little while to convince some people. And I'm going to have mercy and grace for you, Pharaoh, until you learn this. Next plague comes, plague number 8, the locusts. Remember locust season here? We had locusts, 5, 6, 7 years ago. They were all over the place. You guys remember this? They'd fly in your car and buzz around. All over your windshield. Grasshoppers, we call them. It says it covered the ground until they were black. Swarms of locusts could occupy up to 400 square miles. Picture that, of occupying the ground so that you can't even see the grass. In 1 square mile, it's estimated there could be 100 million locusts, all of whom eat their body weight each day. That's a lot of devastation. That's a lot of destruction. But not in Goshen, where the Israelites lived. Plague number 9, darkness. It says, darkness fell over the land for 3 days, a darkness that can be felt. I don't think I've ever been that dark before. Yesterday I went through the dark slide down at the hot springs. Everybody done the dark one before? That's pretty dark, isn't it? I'm a little afraid of the dark, especially when I'm zooming down a water slide, wondering where is the end. I can't feel my way. I can't see anything in there. That's the 9th plague. We've seen a progression here, haven't we? From annoying to, oh wow, this is really difficult. Things are actually dying, and now a distinction between God's people and Pharaoh's people. Does Pharaoh get it? Does Pharaoh let the people go? No. His heart continues to be hardened. He continues, it doesn't matter if his people are dying, if his livestock is dying, if all of his people under his leadership are miserable, he doesn't care. His heart is hard. So God says, all right, plague number 10 is coming your way. Will you listen to this one? If all that other stuff didn't matter, will you listen to this one? Be warned. Exodus 11. Verse 4, so Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the slave girl who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. How did we get to this? Are you asking yourself that question? If you're Pharaoh, even if you're Moses, if you're anybody watching this, how do we get to this situation? How could we be this? There's a theological question here too, isn't there? How could a good God let these bad things, help cause these bad things happen to people? These are questions I guess we'll have eternity, if we know Christ, to ask God and to understand maybe a little bit better. It's hard sometimes to understand this, but you know what? The reality is God has ordained it that there would be human leaders in his creation that would have a lot of domain and exercise a lot of authority, hasn't he? And they cause a lot of destruction at times too. World War II. Anybody know how many people died in World War II? Over 60 million people died in World War II. It was over 2.5% of the world's population dead because of a handful of crazy rulers who had their own ideas in mind, who thought that they were God and who had hard hearts towards people. Up until now, God has tried 9 times, 9 object lessons, 9 myth busters that didn't sway Pharaoh because his heart was hard. Hard-heartedness. I think it's the same in our day as an idea of being hard-headed as well. You know anybody who's hard-headed? Yeah, point to them. Yeah. How many remember a story that happened down in Breckenridge about 5 or 6 years ago? Construction worker by the name of Patrick Lawler. Has anybody heard the story of this guy? He's a construction worker. He's out there working at the construction site. He's got one of those nail guns, right? Apparently there was a misfire in the nail gun. A 4-inch nail somehow went up through the roof of his mouth into his brain. Do you think he ran to the hospital? He didn't even know it happened. 2 days later, he's complaining of a toothache. My tooth hurts just a little bit. His girlfriend or fiance or whatever it was a dental assistant. So a couple days later, he goes into the dental office. They look up in his mouth, see a nail head sticking out of the roof of his mouth, and say, we got to get you to the ER quick. Here's a picture of this guy. Hard-headedness, isn't it? Hard-heartedness. You guys are enjoying that.
Next slide.
So here's the funny thing. Here's the interesting thing. This whole idea of hard-headedness, or especially hard-heartedness like we're reading about here in Exodus, was something that the Egyptians had come up with, okay? They believed that when they went into the next life, if their heart had any secrets or any sin in it, it could give it up in the next life. So what they would actually do is cut the heart out of the wealthy dead people and put a heart of stone in there so that their secrets and their sin wouldn't ever be exposed, wouldn't keep them out of the next life. Isn't that crazy? It's this idea of hard-heartedness. Remember this, Pharaoh had enslaved the Israelites. He had frustrated them. He had mistreated them. And as we saw it last week, he had killed thousands and thousands of babies. Innocent little babies, had them thrown into the Nile. His heart was hard. His actions were horrific. And now God says a final plague will come on you, Pharaoh, and your people, since you won't listen to me, since your heart is so hard. But on this particular plague, there will be a way to get out of it. There will be a way to be passed over from this plague. Exodus 2, verse 7 says they are supposed to find a lamb. They are supposed to kill a lamb. They are supposed to drain the lamb's blood, eat the lamb. And then Exodus 12, verse 7 says this. They are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and the tops of their doorposts. I've got a jar of paint. Looks like blood, doesn't it? Imagine this. You have just killed a lamb. You've collected its blood. The angel of death will come that night unless you do something, unless you paint the blood on the doorposts of your house. I haven't practiced this. I hope I don't drop any. You got to get out there with the blood. You got to put it on the sides of your house, on your doorposts. You've got to put it there to mark your house. You want to pass it over, that you are listening to God, that your heart is soft towards God, that you believe his word to be true, and that he takes hard-heartedness and that he takes sin seriously. Imagine what was going through the people's thoughts and minds that night. We've already seen a lot of bad stuff happen. Something more powerful than that is coming. How must we prepare? God gives them that instruction. Exodus 12, verse 12. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. Verse 13, the blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. Then it comes, right? Just like God predicted, just like he had told them to prepare for. Verse 29, at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. A hard heart allowed it to come to this. There's a myth, the final myth, that Passover, that forgiveness from sins can occur without blood. You know anybody in your realm of friends that believes this myth? I'm not as bad as the other guy. I've never done this many bad things. Even God's people needed the Passover to not be affected by this plague. Verse 13, the blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. This was to be a sign for them, but it would be a signal for the future. Right? This was a sacrifice for one time, for one group of people. There would be a sacrifice coming for all times, for all people. About 1,500 years later, this blood would be provided, though. You don't have to get your own lamb. One has been provided for you. Who's that? Jesus would come and offer his own sacrifice. See, the reality is all of us have a hard heart. All of us have got a nail stuck in us somewhere, somehow. The blood of Christ. Forgives us of sin and helps us be passed over from the consequences of our own doing. Isaiah 53, verse 6 says this. It's a prophecy about Jesus. And the Lord has laid on him, Jesus who would be coming, the iniquity of us all. Verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was like a lamb led to the slaughter. Jesus is the Passover lamb, correct? 1 Corinthians 5:7, Paul says, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. John 1, John the Baptist looks at Jesus the first time he ever sees him. Look, he says, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. How will you be passed over? Why would you wait? Why would you not paint the doorpost? It's a house. It symbolizes a house. We're talking about taking that in our heart. And we're going to give a chance for all of us to come take communion. Jesus sat down at a Passover celebration, remembering Passover, this very same thing, and said, it's going to be different now. I'm making a new deal. I'm going to be the lamb. My body will be sacrificed. My blood will be shed so that you don't have to do this anymore and that you know that your sins can be forgiven.